When I'm preparing a case for class, one of the things that I do is I make sure that I actually read the case thoroughly. There's no skipping this step. It is well worth doing the case reading and thinking about, before I read the teaching note, how I would apply various theories and concepts and how I plan to teach the key ideas behind the case. The second thing that I do is I really start to think about how the students would relate to this case and what are some of the problems or potholes that the students might fall into. And I try to ensure that I've developed the case discussion in a way that students can really understand where these pitfalls and problems are in terms of their decision-making process. And the third thing I do is I put together a class plan. I really think about how I'm going to use the discussion questions, if there are other activities that I want to do using the case, so for example, a role play or some other in-class activity. And then I think about which students I may want to ask to respond to the case. So in teaching cases, there are always students who use a lot of airtime, and they're very bright and capable, but they tend to overwhelm and dominate a class discussion. So I start to think about the quieter students and how I can get them involved in the discussion. I may cold call them, or I may warm call them, let them know in advance that I'm going to call on them. But having that class plan and that clear strategy about how you're going to manage that case discussion is really critical. So that's really how I do it.
I usually start with, what are the 2 or 3 ideas I want the students to walk away from the class remembering? And they're rarely case facts, they're concepts. And then I organize my discussion around that. So you're looking for leverage points or ways to cut into the topic. And what you want is a case where things are fairly balanced on both sides, and you could argue it either way. And then my task as the instructor is to organize a case discussion into 3 or 4 of what I call pastures. And then within each pasture, you have to have a set of questions to bring out the key concepts. But when you're within a pasture, you let the students kind of roam around and have the feel that they are organizing the discussion. They're driving the discussion, but you don't leave that pasture until they've kind of covered the material. And then you have to have some transition ideas. You move them on to the next pasture. You open it up with a fairly broad question, and then you let them go at it. So I tend to think in terms of what are the final takeaways. I'll have 3 or 4 discussion areas. Typically each is 10 to 20 minutes long. And within each of those, there's a problem to solve, and then there's some small takeaway that cumulatively those cement the learning.
I always like to have a teaching note because it starts to give me a bit of insight into where the writer of that case was going in their thinking. I like having them to scan through and start to form my own kind of framework and ideas for the case. When I actually am ready to sit down and prepare, what I'll do is go through, I'll make lots of notes on the case. I'll be considering, again, my learning outcomes, looking at different frameworks maybe I want to bring into the discussion. And then I'll ultimately end up with lots of notes and lots of scribbles all over the place, but I'll bring that down to always a half-page summary of the case. I force myself to use half a sheet of paper, and I capture everything that I want to cover on the case in that half page. And for me, that's always kind of my point of reference in the classroom. If I'm forgetting my place, or I kind of want to check in with where I'm at in the flow of the case, I'll just quickly scan my little half sheet and I'll know exactly where I am. So that's kind of my general approach to preparing.
So the first thing I do when I'm preparing a case for class is think through, during the time block that I have for that case, whether it's 60 minutes or 90 minutes or a 3-hour class, how it's going to flow through the class discussion. So many of the cases that I use have already, in their teaching notes, put together a really great teaching plan for how I can think through how the case is going to flow in the classroom. But then I also think through, looking at the assignment questions that I've asked them to prepare for the class, what it's going to look like from start to finish. So I actually go and I create a board plan, really mapping out how I'm going to lead and facilitate the discussion during the course of the case analysis that I'm asking students to perform. And for me, that's a really critical step. I need to really think through what it's going to look like, because I think one of the really great things about teaching with cases is that you don't really know all the time where the conversation is going to go. So you need some anchors in that conversation in terms of the analysis that students are going to do, so that when it goes off topic a little bit, and I think that's a great thing, you have mechanisms to bring it back to that conversation.
The first step would be to kind of go through the case, go through the teaching note, understanding kind of, what is the case about. I might like the case itself and the company they're using, the general topic, but I might try to give a bit of a different topic or different understanding through the case. So I will develop my own teaching plan, and the teaching plan sometimes will be very similar to the teaching note, but sometimes it will include different aspects that are not in the teaching note. Then you think about, what am I trying to achieve in this specific class? What am I trying to teach the students? I think it's important to think about cases, that's one tool, but that should be kind of like, the basis of your, if you think about it, a meal, that's the basis of the meal, but then you need to think about what kind of other ingredients can I add to it that makes the meal, kind of unique, and also that the people that are dining could actually get the best out of it. And then afterwards, that's the truth. Whenever you use a case, it's going to take some time until the case runs well. So you run it the first time, you see what are the issues. I think one of the biggest challenges that you might have in teaching a case for the first time is you really don't know what the challenges are. So you might find suddenly students get hung up on something that you really didn't think that they're going to spend so much time on, and you find spending half an hour in class on this issue that is they really don't understand. Now, you might not know it the first time. Ideally, the teaching note talked about this somewhat. These are the things that students will have trouble with. But if they didn't, then the next time you obviously need to adjust. So I think that teaching cases is also, it's a kind of, continuous improvement process. You have to continue and kind of think about, how do I teach it better? How do I deliver more from this case?
The tendency, I think, is to highlight everything just like the students do and to over-prepare. What I do is really just use the margins of the case, I'm still using paper and pencil versions, and make some key notes like this means that, or some question marks beside it, so that when I'm going through my own preparation, I focus on those areas. Try to distill it down to a manageable amount of questions. So what I do is I create a Word document that actually has the questions I'm going to use in class. So I don't rehash a lot of the case facts as much in my own notes and preparation, but really focus on what questions am I going to ask in the classroom that will drive the students to create a really rich analysis and a rich discussion.
One of the first things you always go back to is, what's the learning objective? What are the 3 learning points I'm hoping the students take away from? And in some ways, I set that almost as my thesis for the class, and I build my preparation backwards from that. What I do in preparing a case is actually 2 forms of preparation. The first one is I sort of create a narrative for the class. How do I want to go through it? How am I going to start the case? I think about, am I going to start the case by asking a student for, what would you do if you were the protagonist in this case? Sometimes if it's a setting they're less familiar with, for example, in Canada, when I'm doing a case in India, if it's one of the early cases, I'll ask people who's had experience in India, so they understand the differences in the business environment in India and Canada. So you decide your opening, sort of a 5 or 10 minutes, and then the narrative of how do you go through the questions, how do you build a case, always leading towards those 3 sort of final takeaways. When you come through that process, you end up with I usually end up with a 4 or 5 page script of how I plan to go through class. Then what I do is I turn it into a board plan. I look at the boards that I have in my classroom, and I have to do this for every class that I'm teaching because the boards are different. How is that going to look on the boards when I take down students' notes? What am I looking for? And it allows me to make sure that the most important parts of the discussion are brought out and shown to the students in a logical fashion, given the room that we're working in.
I think you get better at prepping cases the more you use them, for sure. So I do a couple of things. I always read the case again quickly. Hopefully previously I've done some other prep around, if we go this direction, I'd like to get this framework in. I know I need to get it in the course of the curriculum, but really it's about making sure that you can go with the case in the direction that that the class wants to go with, because that makes for a more enriching and exciting, engaging class for them. I think faculty sometimes, when they're new to the case method, think that, I have to do this, 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 and this today. And if you only have one class with them, maybe that's true. But fortunately, when we have longer courses, you have the opportunity to come back and forth. And so I think a mistake is to force it. I think what you want to do in preparing is have some breadth to go in different directions and some confidence to go in different directions with it. Some of that will come with time. Some of it is just being prepared, asking yourselves that what if? What if they go this direction? What if they go that direction? And sometimes you'll have to say, they're going that direction, I got to bring them back because that's really not where I want to go with them.
Teaching notes are a great aid for professors who are not familiar with case teaching, or even those professors who are familiar with case teaching, because it will give one or two perspectives on how a case should be taught. And typically you'll have questions with answers that you can push the students on in class to get the discussion going. And you'll also have typically, if it's an 80-minute class, you'll have a class schedule, spend so much time on this topic, so much time on this topic. And I find those are helpful for me when I'm developing a new case to teach for the first time. And it was very helpful to me as I was a new faculty member here at Ivey using case methodology for the first time.